Hi guys, this video is the second in our series on unemployment, and we're going to be looking in this chunk at the main causes of unemployment. You'll see these referred to as types of unemployment or causes of unemployment. They mean the same thing. 4 basic reasons why unemployment exists in an economy: frictional, seasonal, structural and cyclical. We're going to look at all 4 as well as some of the policies to reduce them. Frictional, seasonal and structural are known as supply side unemployment or voluntary unemployment, and we'll see why that is shortly, while cyclical we refer to as demand side involuntary unemployment. Let's start with frictional. Frictional unemployment is unemployment due to the transition between jobs. It's always present in the labour market, but the amount of frictional unemployment, the length of time people are unemployed between different jobs, can differ. Let's meet Reginald. Reginald's just left his job, and I'd like you to have a think about 2 questions. Have a read of the little extract, and then ask these 2 questions. What factors are causing Reginald's frictional unemployment to last longer than it might otherwise? And to what extent do you think Reginald's unemployment is therefore voluntary? Pause the video and have a think. What factors are driving Reginald's unemployment? I've spotted a few things. There's some push factors. He's not happy with the job he's got. He's thinking about the wage, the amount he's earning in that job, and weighing that up. That's motivated his decision to leave. One factor is how much money he has to survive without a job. The more he has to last, the more he can last without a job, the more time he's going to be able to spend looking for jobs. He's found some jobs online, but he's looking for a certain type of job, a well-paid job, an interesting firm. He's found one job, but he's unsure. He's not completely convinced he's ready to commit. Is it therefore voluntary unemployment? Well, most economists would argue yes, because Reginald is choosing to do this. He could have stayed at his job, but he chose to make the switch. Voluntary doesn't mean it's not sensible. It just means unemployment is caused by a worker making a choice. Let's dig into a little bit more of what causes frictional unemployment in general. Key concept is something called search theory. By search theory, economists are just referring to the idea that when workers leave a job, they spend time searching for the best alternative, and there's going to be a variety of factors that affect that search time. One factor is their reservation wage. That's the minimum wage workers are willing to work for. As a teacher, I might have a certain wage in mind that I'm not going to be prepared to work for less than. The cost of searching is significant. If searching is not very expensive for workers, then they're going to search for longer. And the big thing that affects how expensive, how costly searching is the availability of benefits. If when I'm between jobs I have no money, then I'm not going to search for very long. I'm going to accept the first job I find. But if benefits are really high, searching isn't very costly. I'm not losing much income, so I can afford to search for longer. This is less relevant these days, but the availability of information is really significant. If I don't have information on the jobs that are available, I'm going to struggle to find jobs that meet my criteria. That's less relevant in the internet age. And we could argue that risk aversion is a factor. Risk aversion is the idea that economic agents don't like risks. And committing to a job is a risk, because we commit to one job as some options. So risk aversion can mean economic agents, workers spend longer looking for jobs because they're reluctant to commit to an individual area. We consider frictional unemployment to be voluntary because workers are choosing to keep looking for a job. Strictly speaking, if I left my job as a teacher, I could go and work at McDonald's for a much lower wage. I choose not to accept jobs that are available because I've got in mind what I want to do and the wage I want to work for. So frictional unemployment is voluntary, and we consider it supply side because it's driven by workers' decision to supply their labour to the market. It's not about the demand for labour, the number of jobs being offered. It's about workers choosing not to apply for those jobs because they're waiting for better ones. The key concept to summarise a lot of that is the replacement ratio, which is the disposable income out of work divided by disposable income in work times 100. So the disposable income out of work, that's mainly going to be benefits, job seekers benefit, job seekers allowance. Disposable income in work is the wage I get minus taxes when I'm in work. And the bigger, the more disposable income I get when I'm out of work, the closer that ratio is going to be to 100. The bigger that ratio becomes, the more workers can afford to wait. A higher ratio means less incentive to work because the income out of work gets closer and closer to the income in work. Okay, have a think. Based on what we've seen, if I'm the government and I want to reduce the rate of frictional unemployment, what policies might I put in place? Again, pause the video and take 2 minutes to think, what policies could you do? What kinds of things might the government want to do to reduce frictional unemployment? Here's some things I got. We want to think about information. Providing more information is going to make it easier for people to find the jobs that best meet their requirements. The main way the government does that is by providing job centres and providing links between workers and employers. I might want to reduce unemployment benefits. If I reduce the income people get when they're out of work, that might incentivise them to find work more quickly. On the other hand, if people get very little income when they're out of work, they might be reluctant to leave their job to find a better one, even if that might be sensible. And it might be considered unfair when people are made redundant or lose their jobs in a recession. Similarly, I could improve the disposable income in work. If I lower income tax, I'm going to improve the disposable income people receive in work and therefore make them more likely to choose jobs sooner. So that's frictional unemployment, is that wait time between jobs as workers look for jobs that meet their requirements, particularly with wages. Let's talk briefly about seasonal unemployment. Seasonal unemployment just refers to the regular seasonal changes that we see in employment and labour demand. It's going to particularly affect certain industries like catering and leisure, which are going to have boom periods, particularly over Christmas and holidays. Construction, which has a dip over the winter when it's harder to build. Retail, tourism, agriculture for similar reasons. Seasonal unemployment varies seasonally. It's the least important type of unemployment. You're never going to get asked a question on it. We usually lump it in with supply side unemployment because it's about labour, where labour chooses to supply their labour, workers choosing to work in seasonal industries, and therefore we'd argue it's voluntary. But equally, it's other economists would argue that it's primarily demand side because it's driven by fluctuations in demand in the economy. And in that sense, it's involuntary. It's not that workers choose not to work, it's that there's just less demand in those industries. It's kind of both. And the good news is, it is the least significant type of unemployment. You're never going to need to explain it in detail, but you just need to be aware that this is going on. Most unemployment data we look at will be seasonally adjusted. It will have been modified to average out this seasonal fluctuation. Structural unemployment is much more significant. Structural unemployment occurs when changes in the whole macroeconomy create a mismatch between the demand for workers and the skill set of the labour force. It means that some jobs are eliminated and others are created for which the unemployed workers are unqualified. For example, we might think about the decline of northern industry in the UK as we've had increases in high-level manufacturing or service industries. So think industries like shipbuilding and coal mining are massively less significant in the UK now. They were predominantly based in the northeast. Instead, we've seen the rise of industries like finance, insurance, the service sector, high-level manufacturing, creative industries, which have tended to be more based in the southeast. And that's led to persistently higher unemployment in the north, the northeast and the Midlands of the United Kingdom. There's two key components of structural unemployment. There's got to be some structural change. There's got to be a movement in the whole economy. For instance, the decline of heavy manufacturing in this country. But there's also got to be some immobility. Structural change doesn't create unemployment unless workers can't move between industries. If we get the two of them together, we get structural unemployment. The key thing to note with structural unemployment is that it's not that there's fewer jobs available in the economy. It's just that there's different jobs. There's a change in the pattern of demand for labour. And if workers can't adjust accordingly, they're going to be out of a job. Big change we might see in this country have been things like changes in technology. The rise of the internet has displaced a lot of workers, but also created lots of jobs. Changes in the United Kingdom's comparative advantage. Now that's a term we'll meet when we look at trade, but that just means the area in which we're most effectively able to trade with other countries. It's no longer heavy manufacturing. We've been outcompeted in that regard by other countries abroad. Now the UK exports many more services, financial services, intellectual property and things like that. And so linked to that, globalisation is going to be a really big driver of these structural changes. Now we're never going to manage to stop structural change in the economy. There's always going to be changes, otherwise we'd still be in caves killing saber-toothed tigers. Structural change is inevitable. Economists do see these long-term changes. The real issue with structural unemployment is how mobile our workforce is. And there's two big types of labour immobility. One is geographical immobility, where workers cannot move around a country to find jobs. And that creates persistent differences in unemployment. I think the big piece of context in the UK for this is the housing market, where there are huge differentials in house prices. Now, a common mistake here is that candidates write that building better transport links would solve geographical immobility. That's not necessarily the case. Transport links might make it easier for workers to commute, but they're not going to make it easier for workers to move house. They might give workers a slightly bigger area in which to look for jobs if they can commute more easily, but they're not going to make it easier for workers to actually move around the country. The reason for that is that what you have to spend to buy a nice 3-4 bed house in the northeast might only buy you a 2-bed flat in Oxford. So it might be that there's no jobs in Newcastle but plenty in Oxford, but workers can't move because they can't afford it. Similarly, occupational immobility is when workers can't move between industries. So for example, if I lose my job in shipbuilding, it might be that there's other jobs in the same city but they're in something completely different. And that's because it's too expensive to retrain. Now we do consider structural unemployment to be voluntary despite these. And the reason for that is that even though it's very difficult for workers to be mobile, it's still their choice. So take the housing example. Workers could technically choose to move south. They might just have to sell their large house and accept a much smaller one. Remember, the fact that it's voluntary doesn't mean it's not a sensible choice. The key idea with voluntary unemployment is that just that it is a worker choice. This is therefore a supply side issue. It's not that there's not enough demand for workers, it's that the supply of workers doesn't match that demand. Workers aren't supplying their labour to the right industries. Based on that, how do we reduce supply side unemployment, frictional and structural in particular? Well, unemployment is never going to be fully eliminated. We're always going to see, firstly, structural changes in the pattern of demand over time. We're going to see changes as businesses rise and fall, and that's an inevitable part of the market mechanism. We're going to see workers joining and re-entering the labour market and changes in technology and method of production. So if we're going to reduce supply-side unemployment, by which we mean frictional and structural, policymakers need to focus on reducing the time spent searching for jobs, frictional unemployment, and reducing the immobility of labour. So we're thinking things like improving information on job vacancies, changing benefits to affect their replacement ratio with things like benefits caps, forced job applications, making it harder to claim benefits without proving that you're applying for jobs, setting rules for benefits, and setting time limits for how long you can claim benefits for. We might do things like reducing income taxes to increase the replacement ratio, providing training schemes to make the unemployed more occupationally mobile, subsidies to firms that train labour, making it easier to move between industries, providing housing, social and council housing to increase the geographic mobility of labour. Loads of different things that we could think about to reduce supply-side unemployment. There's a really big overlap here to supply-side policies, which we'll look at in topic 6. But we need to have some idea of some of the ways governments could reduce supply-side unemployment, that's frictional and structural. Lastly, let's look at cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is just the idea that unemployment rates fluctuate with the economic cycle. So when a recession hits, unemployment rises. Take 2008. We can see that unemployment rose to about 8.1%. And that's the pattern that tends to happen during recessions. All of these spikes in the last 50 years have been due to recessions primarily, though not exclusively. And so the causes of cyclical unemployment are just the causes of our economic cycle. Demand and supply side shocks. So financial crisis 12 years ago, coronavirus now. Government policy perhaps. Fiscal and monetary tightening to combat inflation has caused recessions and therefore unemployment to rise. External factors like oil crises, animal spirits, the sentiment of the market. We'll think more about that. There's more on that in topic 4 to look at. Topic 3, animal spirits, asset price bubbles collapsing can cause the cycle to dip. Remember, the key link is thinking about the demand for labour. If we're in a recession, national income is falling. Less is being produced in the economy as a whole. And what that means is that firms demand fewer workers. The key technical term, remembering back to topic 2, is that labour is in derived demand. Firms demand workers to make output. So if there's less output being made, firms demand fewer workers, and therefore unemployment rises. Cyclical unemployment is demand side, because it's about demand for labour. It's also involuntary. It's not necessarily that the workers are choosing not to work. It's simply that there aren't enough jobs available. How do we reduce demand side unemployment? Well, this largely links to fiscal policy, which is topic 6. So do go and have a look at the videos on government spending and taxation to see some of the ways we can manage the demand side of the economy and solve cyclical unemployment. But in essence, a Keynesian economist would advocate using demand management policies, fiscal policy, government spending and taxation to increase aggregate demand and therefore reduce unemployment. They might use monetary policy, dropping interest rates and increasing the money supply, again, in order to increase aggregate demand, increase economic activity, and reduce unemployment. Remember, spending and taxation, we're thinking fiscal policy, much more in topic 6 and topic 7 to think about fiscal and monetary policy. And the key idea with all of this demand management stuff is the concept of the multiplier. Keynesians argue that government spending is particularly effective because the multiplier from government spending is greater than 1. 2 is perhaps 2 or 3. And that means when the government spends a bit of money, the impact on the economy is much bigger. And that means government spending is a particularly effective way to increase the rate of recovery from a recession and therefore decrease cyclical unemployment. We'll look at some of the criticisms of demand management policies in topic 6. You could go and have a look at those videos if you have questions. But the big criticisms are things like the fact that they cause inflation. When we increase aggregate demand, it reduces the output gap, it increases national income, but it's going to cause inflation. It's very difficult to measure the negative output gap and know how much the economy needs to be stimulated to return to its productive capacity. Expansionary fiscal policy, where the government increases spending, is expensive and it needs to be financed either by borrowing, which has problems, or by taxing more, which minimises the positive impact of it. And we look in topic 6 at the concept of crowding out, the idea that when the government spends more money, private sector investment might reduce. So we've looked at 4 big causes of unemployment: frictional, the movement between jobs; seasonal, seasonal fluctuations in unemployment; structural, when structural change plus labour immobility causes long-term unemployment in the economy; and cyclical, and the idea that unemployment rises in a recession. We thought as well, in brief, about some of the policies to manage these things. In a future video in this topic, we'll think about exam application. But we should, by the end of this video, be able to explain each of these 4 different causes, be able to outline the main things that drive them, and be able to discuss, at least in brief, some of the ways the government might reduce various different types of unemployment.